The 1960s counterculture did not happen overnight, but I think it's fair to say that it bloomed in San Francisco. And this was due to a nascent music scene that was about to explode. And the explosion was ignited by an unlikely band called the CHARLATANs. We're going to find out how they propelled the San Francisco music scene here on Pop Goes the 60s.
That's all.
By the mid-1950s, San Francisco had a reputation for drawing several beat writers and poets to it like Allen Ginsberg. And by the mid-60s, the folk and jazz clubs started being transformed into the new electronic sounds brought by the Beatles, Dylan, and the Byrds. Now, while the outlook of the beatniks was a little more bleak and cynical, this new generation, which is to become the hippies, they were more social, sunshiny, and youthful. One of these of this new generation was a guy named George Hunter, an architect by trade, left the Los Angeles area to follow his girlfriend Lucy Lewis, who was going to San Francisco State College. This was in 1962, and it was here that he met Richard Olson, a Chicago transplant who was interested in getting involved in the Bay Area's beatnik jazz scene. Hunter's experimentation with John Cage-type electronic music led him and Richard Olson to work for Lucy Lewis's avant-garde dance company called 1-2-3. The trigger that launched 1,000 Scenes was the Beatles' appearance on Ed Sullivan in 1964. And George Hunter was watching the Fabs with another mover and shaker in San Francisco at the time named Chet Helms. It was after this experience that he wanted to start a band. And the Beatles made him realize that pop music was no longer for the kids. It was no longer bubblegum. In spring of 1964, George Hunter bumped into an old friend named Mike Wilhelm, a guitar player who was also a transplant from the LA area, who was playing blues and folk in the folk clubs down there. And Wilhelm ended up moving in with them and they started to form a band. Now, Richard Olson was a music major and a clarinet player. He decided to switch to bass guitar so he could sing. It wasn't long before pianist Mike Ferguson joined them, and then drummer Sam Lind, who lived upstairs from Lucy and George, but he didn't last very long. He was quickly replaced by Dan Hicks. Now, of these five, George Hunter was the least musically talented of the group. He didn't really play an instrument, so he took up auto harp, he played tambourine, and he did do some singing. Now, the auto harp was kind of interesting. This was starting to get electrified by other bands, and he did the same thing, and he also started to modify it to get different chord sounds on that instrument. Mike Ferguson, the piano player, he was an interesting person because he dealt in antiques and he had a shop where he had vintage clothing and different things. And this started to mesh with what the band wanted for their image. Ferguson's style of playing was more of like a ragtime barroom saloon piano, which really kind of blended with Wilhelm's folk and blues background. Now, Hunter was a little more electronic and avant-garde, but he became essentially the de facto manager of the band and started to steer the band's image as well as their music. Originally, George Hunter saw the band as kind of an electronic avant-garde type of band, and the name The Androids was thought of, but the guys that they brought together didn't have that background. They were more folk and blues and old-timey music, so they began to search for a new name, and one of the names they came up with was the Mainliners. Now, this was not really an accident, because when Hunter came to San Francisco, it wasn't long before he got involved in the drug culture, namely amphetamine and heroin. And this friend I mentioned earlier, Chet Helms, who was going to be a pretty central figure in developing this San Francisco scene, he had introduced Janis Joplin to the band at this time. This is pretty early, late 64, maybe early 65. Because Janis Joplin had a kind of a folk and blues background, he contemplated asking Joplin to join the Charlatans as singer. But and the reason that she was hanging around the band is because George Hunter was supplying her with heroin. But Hunter thought better of it. He thought, well, we already have one person with a drug problem in this band. Maybe a second one wouldn't be a good idea. So the possibilities of Janis Joplin joining the Charlatans was just an idea. She continued to perform solo in Texas and in San Francisco. Having chosen the name the Charlatans, this name just breathed life into the image they wanted for themselves. And with Victorian San Francisco as a backdrop, they started picking up on this Old West theme. And it worked perfectly because Mike Ferguson had this old shop with vintage clothing and everything. They started to go through all this Old West finery and started to outfit themselves with cowboy hats and gun holsters and roping cuffs and the short vests and guns. they all got into it, and they started taking a lot of promo photos immediately before they even started rehearsing. Well, the band started rehearsals at this time, and they were pretty green and pretty ramshackle sounding. But they did get their first gig, and this was through Mike Wilhelm. But the thing was, it was nowhere near San Francisco. It was in Virginia City, Nevada. Chandler Laughlin was in charge of transforming this 1860s bar hotel into a new club, and he had some folk club management experience, and he had this great idea to do this with live music. So that's how the Charlatans got this gig. So the band showed up about a week before the opening of this place, and it was still being renovated and getting ready for the opening, like a grand opening. And the band had a perfunctory audition where they were dosed with LSD, and they passed the audition. So far, this sounds like the beginning of any band, but one of the things that was interesting here is the element of LSD being added, particularly at the Red Dog Saloon. They also came up with a light show, and everybody's in these costumes so they could almost be somebody else. This became kind of a recipe for how live music was going to be taken in. The Charlatans clearly had style, and they wanted to project their style. And to do this, they did something very shrewd. They created a rock concert poster to promote these shows at the Red Dog Saloon. And they did this themselves. And this was the cheapest way because they didn't have any money. And what they did is Mike Ferguson had an old poster that he based the design on, and George Hunter designed the logo. The band played the Red Dog for 6 weeks and played 6 nights each week, and they really started to hone their sound and their repertoire. And this was aided, the mood was aided by Bill Hall's light show. So this, in addition to the patrons all adopting some of this Old West look, really made for a festive party. It didn't take long for word to get out, and soon people were coming from San Francisco and Seattle and Oregon to see the band and experience this kind of happening. And the music at this time, it was, I guess I'd call it like an old-timey blues jug band type of music that was kind of very barroom-like, and everybody really got into it. It was heavily influenced, I think, by Mike Wilhelm, but everybody brought the elements that they knew to the band. Now, Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters even made an appearance at the Red Dog Saloon to check out what was going on, but they didn't really mesh well with the band because they had their own way of doing a psychedelic experience, and, you know, things get competitive right off the bat, even with acid tests, obviously. So the Old West theme, they took it to kind of a large extent because everybody was carrying guns. They were carrying loaded guns, and they'd go out on their off day and do some shooting and things like that. And that kind of turned off the Kesey's Pranksters a little bit. And but the feeling was mutual. They didn't really like, the Charlatans didn't really like them. So for the festivities to continue at the Red Dog, the drugs had to be imported. You couldn't get any of that in Nevada. So they had to import it from San Francisco. And Mike Wilhelm went on one of these junkets to bring drugs back, and they were busted on the way back. And it was only for a vial of weed. But at this point, I think the band was figuring out what we should kind of get home. John Cipollina was the guitarist slated to replace Wilhelm in case he had to go to jail or something. But that never materialized because the band went back to San Francisco. Now, Wilhelm did escape jail time, and they went back to San Francisco, and he got a gig for the band supporting comedian Don Sturdy, that was a stage name. That was actually Howard Hessman, who was actually a friend of Wilhelm's. So it was a very small world at that time. It was about to get bigger. Now, when they got back to San Francisco, they were surprised that after only being gone a month and a half, that all these bands had kind of popped up and were gigging around. So they all of a sudden had competition. Bands like Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holy Company, just to name a few. Now soon they got regular bookings and headlined 3 shows at the Longshoremen's Hall in October 1965. And this was the first large-scale happening in the area where they had multiple bands playing and several thousand people came to check this out. And they had the light shows, and they were dosing people with LSD. So this became one of the first big happenings in the area. Now, aside from music and LSD, it also combined dancing. Dancing was a big component of this for people to get out and do something, because it was, San Francisco clubs you had to have a special permit, I believe, for dancing, so that you couldn't furnish dance clubs very easily. So they had to go outside the dance hall circuit to make this happen. These larger venues really changed the sound of the bands. Imagine they had these cavernous places with cement floors, so there's a reverberation and a distortion to the music, so that kind of changed the music a little bit. And by the start of 1966, bands were not just competing for gigs, but they were competing for record contracts, and the Charlatans were one of these bands. The local Autumn Records had some interest in the Charlatans, and they looked like they might sign them, so they recorded some demos with the band.
Jacket diamonds, I've known you about the things you did, oh, that make me feel so blue. Oh, baby, don't you know that I love you?
So those are two of the 4 songs that the band recorded for Autumn, and that last one called Number One is a Mike Wilhelm original. It's kind of Buddy Holly meets the Byrds, and it sounded like they had some potential, but the label passed on the band. So they did find a home at Kama Sutra and were given to producer Eric Jacobson to record, and Jacobson had produced The Lovin' Spoonful, and I think there was some similarities with this kind of jug bandy good time feel that the Charlatans played. They may have seen them as kind of a Lovin' Spoonful type of knockoff band. And for their first single, they chose a song called Codeine, which was by Buffy St. Marie.
It's free, Lord, it's free. One more time.
This song best demonstrates the Charlatans' strengths. You've got this distorted auto harp, this bluesy vocal, and Wilhelm does a great solo on it. But Kama Sutra thought, well, the drug connotations were a problem, and they just didn't hear it as a hit. I mean, it's a good song. And the Charlatans saw it as like kind of a House of a Rising Sun type of song. But Kama Sutra didn't see it. Now, the B-side was a Robert Johnson song that showed the band at its most uncommercial.
Got to shoot my pistol, got to shoot my Gatling gun. Got to shoot my pistol.
Despite not releasing that single, sessions continued to record what was possibly going to be an album. And Jacobson was overseeing this, and the band didn't really get along well with him. The band was also still finding their sound, and you can hear that with these recordings.
I'm gonna get it by hook or by crook, yeah, I'm gonna get it by hook or by crook. I just a matter of time, by hook or by crook. I'm gonna lay it on the line, by hook or by crook.
I saw her as she came and went, and she was queenly, meek and mild.
I'd have to be the devil to satisfy my man.
And one of the problems the band brought to the record company was that they were difficult to get along with. They were rather arrogant, figuring they would get like Phil Spector to produce them and things like that. And they just had visions of grandeur, I guess. And things with Jacobson soured a bit. Jacobson did bring a song for them to record, an old Coaster song called The Shadow Knows. This was going to be released on Cap Records. Kama Sutra kind of passed it off to a different label. And this song was more of a novelty song that had really nothing to do with the sound or the style of the Charlatans. And by this time, I think the Charlatans just wanted to get anything out. So they acquiesced to releasing this as a single.
You can change your name and address, even change your style of clothes, but
the shadow knows. The shadow knows.
Now, one of the problems here with the Charlatans is they did not have a manager. So they signed a record deal, which was a really terrible deal. And what band at this stage doesn't sign a terrible deal? I guess whether you have management or not. But they didn't have any muscle as to what to record in the studio. And one of the songs they could have released as a single was a song called Alabama Bound, which had become a stage favorite. It was kind of their signature song. And they recorded, it was a longer song that they would stretch out on, but they recorded one at a single length version of it. But that too remained unreleased. So what they did instead is they ended up using that as the basis to do a commercial for a men's hair product called Groom and Clean.
The scene. Hey, 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 broom and clean, hairdressing made for men.
Now, one thing the band was able to do during the second half of 1966 was to play a lot of live gigs. They were getting great exposure, the scene was exploding, there was demand for bands like them, so they didn't have any problem getting gigs. And as they honed their sound, they were ready to get back in the studio in early 1967. And by this time, their sound had improved and their writing had also improved.
I often go out walking with no particular place to go. Hoping, I always wanted a girl like you, one I'd always be coming home to. It's so nice to be my girl, you just can't be you, 'cause we're not on the same track. We're not on the same track.
Well, these are three of their finest originals, and you can hear the proto-psychedelic leanings of a song like Walking. They're making references to Taking a Trip. So these are all things that a turned-on crowd would recognize. So these are recordings are much improved over the prior recordings. And one of the songs that they really did a nice job on was their signature song, Alabama Bound.
Drink your good cherry wine. Let the whiskey be. Let the whiskey be. And let the whiskey be. I'm Alabama bound.
Alabama Bound was a traditional song that they rearranged a bit. They were trying to write new lyrics to it, but they weren't able to do it justice, so they just kept Alabama Bound as it was, and this became a kind of show-stopping song that they'd stretch out on. Now, they also continued to record several other fine tracks during this time in the studio.
How can I miss you when you won't go away? Listen to me. Keep telling you day after day. But you won't. Every star above knows the one I love. Sweet Sue. Just you.
Now, the quality of some of these tracks is not that different than some of the early recordings of Big Brother or The Great Society. But the problem is that so many bands started to form, that the Charlatans started to lose ground quickly, not just with releasing music, but even on stage. And one of the other problems they faced was they didn't get along well with promoters. So they had an attitude, and they didn't get along well with each other either. So through the spring and into the summer of 1967, the band started to appear lower on the bill. They had a tough time breaking through, I think, with getting anything released on record because they didn't really have a strong singer. And this was becoming the age of the virtuoso instrumentalist. And they didn't have one of those either. So they didn't have the instrumental chops to really compete with the very best bands on the scene. An example of them not getting along well with promoters was an incident with Bill Graham. Graham had become the big-time promoter. He was a lot more business-oriented than some of the other hippie promoters like Chet Helms. But there was a benefit that they were doing with the Airplane, Quicksilver, Big Brother, and the Grateful Dead, and the Charlatans were supposed to be on first. And Mike Ferguson showed up late, or he was dilly-dallying, and Bill Graham just made him take all their instruments off the stage, and they didn't even get a chance to play. So that was a source of embarrassment for them, and just how lightly they took some of the nuances of playing live. They ended up taking a residence at a place called Varney's Roaring Twenties, and this was for a good month long or so. And this was more of a tourist crowd, so they were outside of the ballroom scene. And although they did hone their sound more, it wasn't quite the scene that they wanted to be at. And they had a fallout with the owner. The owner wanted them to play the hit song from late '66, Winchester Cathedral, and they refused to play it.
Winchester Cathedral, you're bringing me down.
Now, Varney's was a kind of a strip club. They had like belly dancers and female dancers and things like that. So it was around the corner from the Playboy Club. So Vince Guaraldi, the noted pianist, would often sit in with the Charlatans. So that was a highlight for them. But things started to go bad. One of the main things is that they were not invited to the Monterey Pop Festival. And that was a big, kick between the legs because they really felt they belonged there. They probably should have been there. But the reputation had been going down a little bit, and just other bands were just coming up and kicking their ass, really. So they really were starting to lose ground quickly. Another drug bust saw Richard Olson taking the rap, and they avoided jail time. But the problem was that you had to pay for attorney's fees. So a lot of the money they were making, they weren't making much, but here they had to pay attorney's fees here and for Wilhelm's prior arrest. So that didn't go well. So by fall 1967, the band was rather downtrodden, financially crippled and losing their hold on the scene when Mike Ferguson decided to leave the band. Now, he was the piano player and he was replaced by Patrick Gogarty. And during this time, Dan Hicks started to move to the front of the band and play guitar and sing. He had several original songs. And Hicks was one of the weaker links in the band, instrumentally anyway. He wasn't a good drummer, but he was a decent songwriter, and I think he had desires to be out front. So much so that he formed a satellite band called the Hot Licks, and he started gigging out with this other band a long while being in the Charlatans. So by early 1968, Terry Wilson was brought in as a permanent drummer, and they got back in the recording studio to record another batch of songs. The band started to get a little bit disenchanted because they didn't feel that Hicks's material was really representative of the band. And since he was playing in another band anyway, it just made sense for him to leave at this point. Not long after that, the band essentially fired George Hunter. They parted ways. They were tired of him micromanaging. So the new lineup added Daryl DeVore replacing Gogarty on keyboards, and they became a four-piece band. It would seem that the band would fall apart at this stage with losing some of the key founding members, but what happened was they were working on getting a new record deal, but they had to get rid of the Kama Sutra Cap deal first, so that was settled, and that enabled them to sign with Mercury Phillips. And the timing of this, it basically worked because the new guys, the new four-piece, they were able to go, I think they just worked better together, and they started to record what was to be their debut album. So this is the album. It's just called The Charlatans. Let me pull it out here. And I think people look at this album as sounding a little bit dated, but I think this is a really good album. There's a lot of originals on here, and the production is pretty good. The playing is pretty good. I think you're going to find, if you like kind of folk rock, later period folk rock stuff, this would be for you.
When I go sailing by, you know I must be feeling high. When I go sailing by,
Going for high coin, baby. I ain't going nowhere at all.
Now that last song you heard was High Coin. That was written by Van Dyke Parks, and that's one of the highlights of this record. It was released as a single. It didn't chart, but there are really some fine originals on here as well. And Daryl DeVore wrote quite a lot of them, and they have a breezy psychedelic feel to them.
When we really know that tomorrow is coming regardless, if we come on high.
Love me while your love is easy, and I'll be easy when I'm dead.
Now, the critics weren't very kind to this album, and I can see why. I mean, the competition out of San Francisco especially was far more guitar-based. I mean, you had Santana out by now, and this acid guitar type, and this band was not anything like that. But I think this album is a very even listen, and it's just a softer album, and I think it totally works. And one of the things that makes it work is they did a re-recording of their signature song, Alabama Bound.
If that train don't stop and turn around, I'm Alabama bound.
Now, George Hunter didn't participate on the record, but he did design the album cover and the back. And he always had this style of doing older style things, so that was Hunter's contribution to this. Now, this album might have done better had they been able to tour on it, but they weren't able to tour properly because the drummer, Terry Wilson, had to serve a jail sentence for marijuana. So that essentially ended this version of the band.
I'm stuck in Folsom Prison, and time keeps dragging on.
Now, you would think Terry Wilson's jail sentence would end the band. Well, it basically did, but what happened was it allowed the original 5 members to reunite in the summer of '69 and play together. So they did that, but by the end of the year, they had given it up, and I think the times had passed them by. You know, so ultimately, this music it's not essential 60s listening music. I really like it. I like learning about the early sounds, and they certainly had an effect on the overall scene. Maybe more style than musical substance, but it really helped shape the ballroom experience, which grew into the concert experience we really know today. And that all started at the Red Dog Saloon. I would have loved to have been at some of those Red Dog Saloon shows. That would have been so fun. You know, the Charlatans are often called a pioneering psychedelic band, but as you heard, I mean, they're more folk blues and a little bit country thrown in, and a little bit of psychedelic thrown in. But they were pioneers, I think, mainly because of the style of dress that kicked off kind of a hippie style of sorts, and the combination of LSD at the shows, which was really not their thing. They just happened to be there as this whole thing kind of coalesced. So this album, surprisingly, this has never been reissued on vinyl. It is available on CD. I'd gotten the vinyl years ago, and I got this at least 15 years ago, but now this is out of print, surprisingly. But you can get all this stuff on YouTube. Let me see what else have I got here. So the first thing I got on the Charlatans was the Autumn Sessions. This is a 4-track EP, essentially. I bought this, oh boy, maybe 1990 or so. This came out in '82. It only has 4 songs on it, and I was very disappointed that the liner notes were written in German. So it took me a long time to learn more about the band. I didn't know German. So there is this, and another piece of vinyl that came out recently is The Limit of the Marvelous. This is a selection of songs from '66 to early '68, and there's 15 tracks. And I think this is the only thing on vinyl that's available right now, I believe. This came out a few years ago, but it's pretty good. Then the other thing that you'd want to get, this is available to purchase, is The Amazing Charlatans. This is a CD of all their stuff, the autumn demos up to those early 1968 period. So really, these 2 things is their entire catalog. There are some bootlegs available of some of their live stuff, but the quality is not very good. I would have played it here if it was good enough, but you know, it wasn't. I was lucky enough to see the Charlatans reunite in 1997 at the 30th anniversary of the Summer of Love in San Francisco, so that was a highlight. They sounded great. I really enjoyed them. And by then, Mike Ferguson had passed away, so 4 of the original 5 were there. And ultimately, the Charlatans I consider them a pivotal band in the '60s, and just one of the many bands who helped start and create a scene, but never were able to capitalize on the scene they created. I hope you enjoyed this video. I have more videos coming from this colorful and confusing time here on Pop Goes the '60s.
That's